Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. Have you ever been told a country is perfect, stunning beaches, cute animals, friendly people, and just accepted it without question? Australia is one of those places. Think kangaroos, koalas, barbecues, and the Sydney Opera House, right? But what if I told you that behind this picture, perfect image, lies a history so dark, so shocking, and so hidden that most people in the world have never even heard about it? A history older than the pyramids, filled with forgotten civilizations, mysterious structures, brutal conflicts, vanishing peoples, and secrets deliberately erased from textbooks. Today, we're uncovering Australia's hidden truths, the stories they never taught you in school, the events they tried to bury, and the shocking past that changes everything you thought you knew about this nation. Brace yourself, because after this, you will never see Australia the same way again. Australia holds the world's oldest continuous culture, stretching back more than 65,000 years, and yet most people never learn even a fraction of what that truly means. When we hear the phrase oldest continuous culture, it's easy to brush past it like it's just another trivia fact, but when you slow down and really sit with that number, 65,000 years, it changes everything you think you know about human history. That timeline reaches back far beyond any empire, religion, or civilization you've ever heard of. It's older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Mesopotamia, older than the Great Wall of China, older than the first cities ever built, older than recorded language, older than agriculture in most of the world. And what makes Australia unique isn't just that ancient people lived there, it's that their culture, their knowledge, their traditions, and their understanding of the land continued through an unbroken line for tens of thousands of years. No interruptions, no collapses, no forgotten eras, no vanished cities leaving only ruins behind. A living civilization that adapted, survived, and held on to stories and knowledge older than human memory in nearly any other place on Earth. But the world doesn't talk about this. Textbooks don't emphasize it. Schools rarely teach it. Most people grow up thinking Aboriginal Australians were primitive or simple, when the truth is the exact opposite. This was a civilization with a level of continuity and cultural resilience unmatched anywhere else in human history. Think about it. There are Aboriginal stories that describe events from the end of the Ice Age, stories about coastlines changing when rising seas flooded vast areas of land. These stories were told and retold for 10,000 years with extraordinary accuracy. Modern science later confirmed the exact geographical changes described in those oral histories. Imagine passing a story from parent to child, generation after generation, for hundreds of centuries without writing it down and still preserving the details. No other culture in the world has done that on such a scale. That alone makes this one of the most remarkable achievements in human civilization, and it wasn't just storytelling. Aboriginal people mapped the stars with a level of precision that rivaled early astronomers. They knew which stars foretold the seasons, when certain animals would migrate, when plants would bloom, when storms would come, when the land would change. They created star maps that acted as seasonal calendars. They used constellations not just for navigation, but as teaching tools, cultural archives, and moral lessons. One of the most famous is the emu in the sky. Not a constellation made of stars, but a shape formed by the dark patches of the Milky Way, an understanding of the night sky that required extraordinary observation and interpretation. These star patterns guided travel, hunting, trade, and ceremonial life. Meanwhile, Europeans didn't recognize dark sky constellations until thousands of years later. Aboriginal people also engineered the land in ways most schools never mention. Western historians long portrayed them as nomadic hunter-gatherers, wandering without structure or planning. But new discoveries prove that they practiced sophisticated forms of land management and agriculture. They cultivated native crops, they built vast irrigation systems, they created stone fish traps capable of capturing large amounts of fish without exhausting local populations. One of the most famous examples is the Brewerina fish traps, believed to be one of the oldest human-made structures on the planet. It's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. These traps weren't just random piles of rocks. They were advanced hydraulic systems designed with an understanding of water flow, animal behavior, and seasonal movement. They supplied food for large gatherings and supported complex social networks among different Aboriginal nations. This was not a simple society. This was a skilled, intelligent, adaptive one that managed the environment with respect and scientific precision long before modern science existed. Another thing the world rarely acknowledges is the diversity within Aboriginal cultures. There was not one group, one language, or one unified identity. There were over 500 nations across the continent, each with its own language, laws, customs, stories, and territories. And these nations communicated, traded, formed alliances, and even navigated thousands of kilometers across harsh landscapes using knowledge passed down for millennia. They used songlines, musical pathways that acted like oral maps, to guide long, distance travel. A songline could tell you where to find water, where sacred sites were located, how to move through the land safely, and which routes connected different communities. Imagine a GPS system made of music and memory, existing long before compasses or written maps. This was one of the most advanced navigation systems ever created. And yet, despite all of this, most of the world sees only a watered-down version of Aboriginal history. Schools outside Australia might spend a few minutes talking about Aboriginal people as early humans who lived in the Stone Age, without explaining that they survived ice ages, megafauna, floods, and massive environmental shifts while maintaining cultural continuity. They adapted without destroying the environment. They developed sustainable systems that allowed them to live in some of the harshest climates on Earth, from deserts to rainforests to coastlines. They created social structures based on balance, responsibility, and connection to the land. And they did all of this without losing their identity, even as the world around them changed dramatically over tens of thousands of years. What makes this even more remarkable is that much of their history is encoded in oral tradition rather than written language. Western societies often treat written records as the only reliable form of history, but Aboriginal oral tradition proves that memory, storytelling, and cultural transmission can be just as powerful, sometimes even more accurate. Their stories describe extinct animals, ancient rivers, meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions, and climate events that modern science only discovered recently. They preserved knowledge through ceremony, through art, through songs, through dance, and through connection to sacred sites. Every painting, every carving, every song carried layers of meanings: scientific, spiritual, historical, ecological. It was a multidimensional record of human experience that lasted longer than almost any written archive in the world. This is why calling this the oldest continuous culture is not just a label. It is a reminder that Australia's history did not begin in 1788 when the British arrived. It did not begin with colonization. It did not begin with written documents. It began tens of thousands of years earlier with people who understood the land, the sky, the seasons, and the universe in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient civilizations. And the fact that most of this was ignored, minimized, or erased from textbooks makes it even more essential to acknowledge now. When people hear about Aboriginal culture, they often imagine something small, simple, or primitive. But the real story is far more powerful. It is the story of a civilization that mastered survival, adaptation, knowledge, memory, and connection to the land on a level that remains unmatched in human history. Colonization rewrote Australia's history in ways so deep and far-reaching that even today most people have no idea how much was erased, altered, or hidden. When the British arrived in 1788, they didn't simply establish a settlement and begin building a new society. They created a narrative, a story designed to justify their presence, their expansion, and ultimately their ownership of an entire continent that already belonged to hundreds of thriving Aboriginal nations. And the tool they used to do this was the doctrine of Terra Nullius, a Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one. This was not a casual misunderstanding, it was a deliberate legal strategy. If the land was declared empty, then the British didn't have to negotiate treaties, acknowledge sovereignty, or treat the indigenous population as owners of the land. They could simply move in, take over, and expand without resistance in the eyes of the law. But the shocking truth is that Aboriginal people had lived there for over 65,000 years with systems of governance, farming, trade networks, and cultural laws older than any civilization in Europe. Yet colonization required their existence to be downplayed or erased, and that is exactly what happened. This erasure wasn't subtle, it began from day one. Early British records often described Aboriginal people as savages, primitive, or nomadic. But these labels weren't factual observations, they were political tools. If a group could be portrayed as lacking agriculture, property ownership, or structured governance, then Europeans could claim the moral and legal right to seize their lands. So the narrative was crafted to make Aboriginal societies seem simple or undeveloped. But archaeology, oral history, and modern research reveal a completely different picture. They had complex legal systems, advanced ecological knowledge, structured farming methods, sophisticated water management, and diplomatic protocols between nations. The settlers saw these things but ignored them because acknowledging them would undermine the justification for taking the land. What followed this manufactured narrative was a century-long series of violent conflicts now known as the Frontier Wars. These were not minor clashes. They were organized campaigns of resistance by Aboriginal warriors defending their homelands, and organized counterattacks by British settlers and colonial forces determined to expand. These wars took place across the entire continent, from Tasmania to Queensland to Western Australia, and thousands of Indigenous people were killed. Yet for generations, Australian schools barely mentioned these wars. Many Australians grew up believing colonization was mostly peaceful. The absence of this history wasn't an accident. Colonial governments didn't want future generations to think about the brutality that built the nation, so these stories were buried, glossed over, or rewritten in gentler terms. Memorials were erected for European soldiers and explorers, but almost none for the Indigenous warriors who fought to defend their land. This rewriting of history extended into how Aboriginal people were portrayed in education. For most of the 1900s, textbooks taught a version of history where Aboriginal people were treated as background characters, as if they were fading away naturally. In truth, policies were created to force them to fade away. One of the most devastating examples was the stolen generations. Government authorities and church missions took thousands of Aboriginal children from their families with the stated goal of protecting or civilizing them. But the real intent was cultural erasure. These children were raised in institutions or fostered into white families where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their traditions. They grew up disconnected from their land, identity, and families. This was not a small, isolated event. It lasted from the late 1800s to the 1970s, and for decades governments denied it even happened. Schoolbooks never mentioned it. Many Australians didn't know about it until survivors began speaking publicly in the late 20th century. Another way colonization rewrote history was by flattening the diversity of Aboriginal nations into a single identity. Before colonization, there were hundreds of nations, each with distinct languages, territories, customs, and legal systems. But colonial authorities treated them as one group, ignoring their differences and stripping them of their nationhood. This made it easier to control them politically. If you erase someone's nation, you erase their sovereignty. If you erase their sovereignty, you erase their claim to the land. If people today knew how sophisticated and organized Aboriginal societies were before European arrival, it would challenge the foundations of many colonial myths. Colony expansion also required suppressing Indigenous knowledge. Aboriginal people knew the land deeply. They knew which areas flooded seasonally, where water could be found, which plants healed and which harmed, how to control fires, how to manage ecosystems sustainably. But colonists dismissed this knowledge as primitive, even though it had allowed people to survive for tens of thousands of years in some of the harshest environments on Earth. When colonists ignored this knowledge, they made deadly mistakes, starving during droughts, overgrazing farmland, destroying water systems, and mismanaging fires. Yet instead of admitting that the indigenous knowledge was superior, colonial records framed failures as challenges of taming the land rather than respecting the people who already understood it. What makes all of this even more harmful is that the rewriting didn't stay in the past, it continues to influence the present. For decades, many Australians grew up believing stereotypes about Aboriginal people because they never learned the truth about what happened during colonization. Entire generations believed Aboriginal people had no agriculture because early historians erased evidence of their farming. They believed Aboriginal people didn't resist colonization because the frontier wars were hidden. They believed Aboriginal culture was dying because policies were created to destroy it. These beliefs didn't come from facts. They came from colonial narratives designed to protect the image of the British Empire. Even modern political debates are shaped by these historical distortions. When people argue about land rights treaties or Indigenous sovereignty, they're often debating without knowing the full historical context that was intentionally kept from them. Colonization didn't just conquer land. It conquered memory. It planted a national story that favored the colonizers and pushed everything else into silence. And yet, the truth is still there, waiting to be acknowledged. Aboriginal cultures survived despite the violence, despite the erasure, despite the policies designed to dismantle them. Their languages survive. Their stories survive, their traditions survive, their deep connection to the land survives, and their history, no matter how much colonization tried to rewrite it, is still the real history of Australia. The more people learn about what truly happened, the more they realize how incomplete the school version of Australian history really is, and how essential it is to rebuild that lost truth. Australia's past is filled with events so shocking, so unexpected, and so deeply buried that most people grow up never hearing a single word about them. These weren't small incidents or minor footnotes in history. They were major conflicts, invasions, bombings, government secrets, and national tragedies that were either downplayed or erased from the public narrative. When people think about Australia, they usually imagine beaches, wildlife, calm landscapes, and a peaceful nation far removed from global conflict. But behind that peaceful image are chapters of history that reveal something far more intense, complicated, and dramatic than anything they were ever taught in school. As you start digging into the real story, you realize that Australia was shaped not only by colonization, but also by hidden wars, suppressed attacks, government cover-ups, and dangerous experiments that ordinary people never knew were happening. One of the most shocking hidden events is Australia's long history of frontier conflicts. These weren't isolated fights or spontaneous clashes. They were organized campaigns of violence between settlers, soldiers, and indigenous warriors across every region of the continent. For more than a century, Australia fought its own internal wars, yet most textbooks ignored them. Entire communities were destroyed, land was seized, and massacres were covered up in official reports. For generations, families passed down stories of these horrors because the government didn't document them honestly. Many places people visit today, farming areas, quiet towns, national parks, were once sites of battles or mass killings. But instead of being taught as part of Australia's history, these events were buried under a narrative that painted colonization as peaceful. Even now, historians are still uncovering new evidence and identifying forgotten massacre sites, proving that the violence was far more widespread than anyone admitted for decades. Another shocking truth is that Australia was invaded and attacked multiple times, something that rarely appears in school lessons. During World War II, many Australians are taught about the Pacific War in general terms, but only a fraction are told that Japanese forces actually bombed mainland Australia. The city of Darwin was attacked more than 40 times, more than Pearl Harbor in the number of air raids. Yet most students only hear a brief mention, if at all. Towns in Western Australia and northern Queensland were also targeted. Japanese submarines entered Sydney Harbour, launching torpedoes that killed sailors and caused widespread panic. But for years, these events were minimized to avoid fear and maintain morale. The government didn't want the population to know how close the war came to their doorstep. Many eyewitnesses later revealed that authorities downplayed the destruction, hid casualty numbers, and forced survivors to stay silent to prevent public outrage. Then there is the story of secret military experiments that took place on Australian soil. During the 1950s and 1960s, the British government conducted nuclear tests in Australia, detonating atomic bombs in remote areas of South Australia and Western Australia. Most students only hear a small reference to this, if at all, but the real story is horrifying. Soldiers were ordered to march toward nuclear blast zones, unaware of the long-term health risks. Aboriginal communities living near test sites were exposed to radiation without warning, and many suffered devastating health effects for generations. Radioactive dust spread across large areas, contaminating land and water. But at the time, the government classified most details, refusing to release information even to the affected communities. It took decades before survivors received any recognition, and even today many parts of the test sites remain contaminated. This chapter of history wasn't just hidden, it was intentionally buried beneath layers of political secrecy. Some of the most surprising hidden stories involve Australia's involvement in global conflicts that people rarely associate with the country. Many Australians are unaware of the key role their country played in wars like Vietnam, Korea, and the Cold War, or how deeply Australia was involved in intelligence operations as part of international alliances. Secret listening bases were built, covert missions were launched, and political deals were made behind closed doors. These weren't conspiracy theories. They were real operations later revealed through declassified documents. Yet almost none of this makes it into mainstream history lessons, leaving people unaware of how significant Australia's role has been in global military strategy. there were also internal conflicts and political crises that never reached the public at the time they occurred. For example, Australia faced multiple labour rebellions, economic uprisings, and political battles that shaped laws and social systems in ways students are never told about. Some of these involved violent crackdowns, government surveillance, and attempts to suppress dissenting voices. Many stories of Indigenous resistance, leaders, early activists, and revolutionary figures were erased to maintain a clean, uncomplicated national narrative. Instead of being taught about the full spectrum of voices that shaped the country, students were given a simplified version focused on a few celebrated leaders, while countless others were forgotten. On top of all this, Australia experienced natural disasters and environmental catastrophes that were minimized or poorly documented because acknowledging them fully would highlight government negligence. There were fires, floods, droughts, dust storms, and cyclones that wiped out entire communities. Some events were made worse because authorities ignored Indigenous knowledge that could have prevented or reduced the damage. For example, traditional fire management, commonly known today as cultural burning, was suppressed for decades, leading to more destructive modern bushfires. Only recently has the government started acknowledging how valuable that ancient knowledge really was. What connects all these hidden events is the way they were handled. Instead of being taught openly and honestly, they were filtered, softened, or erased. Governments avoided panic by silencing reports. Officials downplayed threats to maintain stability. Historians left out uncomfortable stories to protect national pride. Generations grew up thinking Australia was untouched, isolated, and safe from conflict, when in reality the country has seen attacks, invasions, massacres, rebellions, bombings, uprisings, and disasters that shaped every part of its identity. The truth is that Australia's peaceful modern image sits on top of a long and complex history filled with moments of courage, tragedy, resistance, and secrecy. Families kept the stories alive long before schools did. Elders remembered events that the government tried to hide. Soldiers whispered truths that officials refused to print. Survivors carried memories that were never written in textbooks. All of these hidden histories matter because they reveal a fuller, deeper, more honest picture of Australia, one that recognizes the courage of those who resisted, the suffering of those who were silenced, and the resilience of those who survived. As more people learn these stories, the nation's past becomes clearer. The hidden chapters no longer stay hidden. The truth becomes part of the conversation, part of public awareness, and part of how Australians understand their own identity. And revealing these forgotten events doesn't weaken the story of Australia. It strengthens it, because only by acknowledging the whole truth can a nation fully understand where it came from and who it truly is. Australia's ancient innovations tell a story that almost no classroom ever revealed. A story that stretches so far back in time that it makes most civilizations look like recent chapters. When people imagine ancient knowledge, they often think of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or China, but long before those civilizations emerged, Aboriginal Australians were already mastering systems that seemed impossible for a prehistoric world. These weren't primitive societies wandering without structure. They were engineers, astronomers, navigators, storytellers, scientists, and environmental managers operating on a timeline so vast it's difficult to fully grasp. Their understanding of the land, seasons, stars, animals, and spiritual concepts formed a knowledge system built across tens of thousands of generations, refined through lived experience rather than written books. And yet most of us grew up never hearing about it, as if this entire intellectual world didn't exist. The truth is that ancient Australia's innovations challenged the entire idea of what advanced. Means because they show that progress isn't only measured through buildings, farming, or written languages. Sometimes the greatest achievements come from harmony with the environment, not domination of it. Imagine a society that could navigate thousands of miles without a map, compass, or written directions. Aboriginal songlines were exactly that. An oral GPS system that mapped the entire continent using memory, rhythm, and story. Every landmark, water source, pathway, and direction was encoded into songs passed from one generation to the next with perfect precision because memory was a sacred responsibility. A wrong turn in the harsh Australian desert could mean death, so accuracy was everything. Elders didn't just teach songs, they taught survival blueprints hidden inside melody. These songs connected tribes separated by thousands of miles, creating a continent-wide network of knowledge long before modern borders existed. And these weren't random trails. They aligned with star pathways, seasonal migrations, and spiritual stories that served as both religious belief and scientific instruction. When Western explorers first arrived, they often got lost and died in landscapes Aboriginal people navigated effortlessly through songlines that had existed since the last ice age. Their astronomical knowledge was just as stunning. Long before telescopes, Aboriginal cultures observed the sky so closely that they understood star cycles, planetary movements, lunar patterns, and even eclipses. Some groups used the phases of the moon to regulate fish, hunting, and ceremonial activities. Others built stone arrangements that aligned with solstices and equinoxes, functioning like ancient observatories. The famous emu in the sky, seen not from stars but the dark dust lanes of the Milky Way, influenced seasonal calendars, telling people when emu eggs were ready to harvest. This understanding wasn't accidental. It came from tens of thousands of years of sky, watching, turning the night sky into a living textbook. Westerners often say that astronomy began with the Babylonians or Greeks, but Aboriginal star knowledge predates them by tens of thousands of years, proving that scientific observation is not limited to civilizations with written records. Then there's the engineering brilliance of structures like the Brewerina fish traps, one of the oldest and largest man-made structures on Earth. Built over 40,000 years ago, these fish traps used complex stone designs to guide fish through channels that allowed selective harvesting without draining ecosystems. This wasn't just clever engineering, it was sustainable engineering, a system designed to protect nature while feeding entire communities. It showed deep understanding of hydrodynamics, fish behavior, and seasonal river flow. Western settlers looked at these structures and couldn't believe Indigenous people built them because the designs were too strategic, too precise, too advanced for their biased expectations. But the truth was undeniable. Aboriginal Australians practiced sophisticated environmental engineering thousands of years before the pyramids were even imagined. Their fire, stick farming was another innovation hidden from textbooks. Instead of letting forests grow wild, Aboriginal groups used controlled burns to shape the land, reduce fuel load, prevent massive bushfires, and promote growth of certain plants and animals. Modern scientists now recognize this as one of the most effective land management systems in history, far superior to many Western practices that led to catastrophic megafires. When Europeans banned these burns, landscapes changed dramatically, ecosystems collapsed, and bushfires became more destructive. It proves that Aboriginal people were not passive inhabitants. They actively managed ecosystems with science rooted in seasonality, animal behavior, and botanical cycles. Fire wasn't just a survival tool, it was agricultural and ecological strategy. Their technological innovations didn't stop there. Aboriginal stone tools displayed such advanced craftsmanship that some archaeologists describe them as manufactured with near-industrial level precision. The boomerang, often misunderstood as a simple toy or weapon, was actually aerodynamics in action. Some boomerangs were designed to return, others to fly straight with lethal accuracy, and others to dig, hunt, or carve. Every shape had purpose, and each tribe refined designs for its environment. Spears had aerodynamic improvements like wobble, free shafts, and some regions created spear rowers that worked like ancient machines, increasing distance and speed far beyond human arm power. This wasn't primitive survival. It was physics applied through generational innovation. Their oral histories preserved information across unimaginable spans of time. Stories described coastlines that existed before rising seas swallowed them more than 7,000 years ago. They remembered volcanic eruptions that Western scientists only recently dated with modern equipment. They recorded ancient animal species, migrations, climate shifts, and natural disasters with accuracy that stunned researchers. For most civilizations, oral history fades after a few generations, but Aboriginal memory systems preserved details for millennia through performance, repetition, art, ceremony, and community responsibility. This was data storage without paper, libraries, or technology, proving that writing is not the only way to preserve knowledge. Everything about ancient Australia shows a world that achieved balance instead of excess, precision instead of waste, and memory instead of written dependency. They created a civilization where knowledge, science, land, spirit, and survival were all connected. Their achievements were not just impressive, they were revolutionary. Yet most of us grew up never learning any of this because history books erased these innovations, leaving generations believing that Aboriginal cultures were simple or primitive. The reality is the complete opposite. They were one of the most advanced, adaptive, and deeply knowledgeable ancient societies ever to walk the earth, carrying wisdom built over 65,000 years, and proving that intelligence is not measured by monuments or machines, but by longevity, survival, and harmony across the ages. Many of Australia's darkest chapters have been hidden, forgotten, or deliberately erased, leaving generations with an incomplete understanding of the nation's past. One of the most devastating examples is the Stolen Generations, a period that spanned from the late 1800s well into the 1970s, during which thousands of Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families by government authorities and church missions. These children were taken under the guise of protection, education, or assimilation, but the true intent was far more sinister: to erase Aboriginal culture and identity. Families were torn apart, languages were silenced, and traditions were deliberately suppressed. Children were placed in institutions or foster homes where they were forbidden to speak their native tongues or practice cultural rituals, often facing neglect, abuse, and emotional trauma. For decades, these experiences were swept under the rug. Governments denied them happened, textbooks omitted them, and schools failed to teach them. Only later, through survivor testimonies and activism, did the truth emerge, revealing a systematic attempt to dismantle an entire culture. But the Stolen Generations were only one part of a broader pattern of cultural erasure and suppression. From the moment the British colonized Australia, policies and practices were implemented to marginalize Aboriginal communities. The doctrine of Terra Nullius, which declared the land belonged to no one, denied the sovereignty of hundreds of indigenous nations. Traditional land management, farming techniques, and ecological knowledge were ignored or outlawed, and Aboriginal people were often forced onto missions or reserves where their movements, behaviors, and practices were strictly controlled. Violence and intimidation were used to suppress resistance, and massacres, frontier wars, and other atrocities were either unrecorded or misrepresented in historical accounts. This deliberate rewriting of history meant that, for generations, most Australians were unaware of the true extent of the suffering and resilience of Indigenous communities. Environmental and health impacts also formed a hidden layer of this tragic history. For example, during the 1950s and 1960s, the British government conducted nuclear tests in remote parts of Australia, often without informing the Indigenous communities living nearby. Families were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, leading to long-term health consequences that affected multiple generations. Government and military authorities attempted to cover up these impacts, classifying reports and denying responsibility for decades. Similarly, industrialization, mining, and agricultural expansion frequently displaced Aboriginal communities from their traditional lands, cutting them off from essential resources, sacred sites, and cultural practices. These displacements were often presented in official narratives as necessary or inevitable, rather than as part of a pattern of systematic marginalization. Another often overlooked aspect of Australia's hidden history involves the long-term social and psychological effects of these policies. Communities that were forcibly relocated or separated experienced profound trauma that continues to resonate today. Loss of language, culture, and land created cycles of marginalization, poverty, and social disadvantage that generations continue to grapple with. Even when legal recognition or compensation has been offered, the emotional and cultural wounds remain deep and pervasive. Schools rarely teach these ongoing consequences, leaving younger Australians with only a superficial understanding of the challenges and resilience of Aboriginal communities. Learning the full story reveals not only the injustices, but also the incredible strength and adaptability of a people who survived centuries of oppression while preserving their identity. Suppression of history also extends to Indigenous resistance and leadership. Aboriginal warriors and leaders who fought to defend their lands, cultures, and communities are often omitted from historical accounts or portrayed in ways that minimize their impact. For example, the frontier wars, which spanned over a century, involved organized military-style conflicts with strategic planning, alliances, and acts of heroism that rivaled anything in European history. Yet for decades, these wars were either unmentioned in school curricula or described as isolated skirmishes. This omission not only erases the achievements of Aboriginal leaders, but also distorts the broader narrative of Australia's colonization, presenting it as peaceful or inevitable rather than contested and violent. Recognizing this resistance is essential to understanding the full complexity of the nation's history. Cultural achievements that survived these periods of oppression are often overlooked or undervalued. Aboriginal art, song, ceremony, and oral tradition continued despite government efforts to suppress them, carrying forward knowledge of the land, the stars, and ecological systems across generations. These traditions were not merely aesthetic, they were functional, storing information about navigation, seasonal cycles, and survival strategies. Many of these cultural practices were maintained in secret or adapted to avoid interference from authorities, demonstrating resilience and ingenuity in the face of systemic oppression. Yet, because these practices were often marginalized in historical accounts, the broader public remained unaware of the sophistication, depth, and continuity of Aboriginal culture. Even the education system played a role in perpetuating historical erasure. For decades, school curricula presented a sanitized version of Australian history, focusing on European settlement, colonial expansion, and nation building while omitting or downplaying the darker aspects of colonization. Children learned about exploration and pioneering achievements, but rarely about massacres, forced removals, or environmental destruction. Textbooks simplified Aboriginal societies, presenting them as static or primitive, ignoring their complex governance systems, agricultural practices, and technological innovations. This selective presentation created generations of Australians with incomplete knowledge, reinforcing stereotypes and limiting understanding of the full human and cultural impact of colonization. The suppression of these stories also had political implications. By hiding injustices and marginalizing Indigenous voices, governments and institutions were able to maintain power structures and reinforce social hierarchies. Recognition of Aboriginal rights, land claims, and sovereignty was delayed or contested because the general population lacked awareness of the historical context. Policies that affected Indigenous communities were implemented without consultation or informed public debate, perpetuating cycles of inequality. Only in recent decades, through activism, legal challenges, and declassified records, has a more accurate understanding of Australia's history begun to emerge, but much of the damage from centuries of hidden oppression remains. Revealing these hidden chapters is crucial not only for historical accuracy, but also for national identity and reconciliation. Acknowledging the stolen generations, frontier wars, forced relocations, environmental destruction, and cultural suppression allows Australians to confront the full reality of their past. It provides context for contemporary social and political issues and honors the resilience of Aboriginal communities who maintained their cultures despite systematic attempts to erase them. By learning the full story, Australians can begin to appreciate the depth of Indigenous knowledge, the complexity of historical events, and the ongoing effects of colonization that continue to shape society today. Ultimately, many of Australia's darkest chapters were hidden intentionally through a combination of legal strategies, government policies, social prejudice, and educational omissions. But uncovering these stories reveals a richer, more accurate, and more human history, one that recognizes both the injustices committed and the extraordinary resilience of Aboriginal communities. It demonstrates how history can be manipulated, how power can control narratives, and how truth can survive even under centuries of suppression. These hidden histories are essential for understanding who Australia really is, where it has come from, and how the nation can move forward with awareness, respect, and reconciliation for its First Peoples.